From the high desert of Boulder, Colorado, a mutant nexus located a mile above the sea level portion of the Babylon Matrix, nestled just beneath the beautiful Flatiron Mountains. This is Jonathan Zapp of ZappOracle.com, and this is the first installment of Zapp Oracle News. And it's also going to cover all the content of the newsletter and more. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I'm tired of hearing people talk about the IPS, the International Podcast Shortage, that I'm sure you're tired of hearing about. And I hear friends and family talk about how they're just watching the same 2 or 3 podcasts again and again because no new podcasts seem to be coming out. Apparently something to do with the supply chain, I guess. I don't understand all the reasons. Jimmy, can you pull up the graphic on the international podcast shortage? Your name isn't Jimmy. Okay, I can't be expected to remember the names of everybody on the whole crew. You're saying there is no crew. I'm just here talking to myself because I'm the only one here. Okay, well, we're going to try and stay positive. And I guess maybe I'm exaggerating the international podcast shortage a little bit, and I used the same intro in my an earlier podcast. So anyway, I have been encouraged to make a weekly addition to the Zapp Oracle YouTube channel, which does seem to get quite a few hours of watching time, and there is quite a bit to catch up on. And I've actually it's been a year since I've sent out a newsletter, partly because the MailChimp interface was just so annoying to use. But Lily Fiorino, who will be the new webmaster of Zapp Oracle, and thanks so much to Tanner Derry, who is at the helm of Zapp Oracle for over 20 years. But it's being taken over by my friend Lily Fiorino, who's a mathematician, AI engineer, polymath, science genius, master technician. She's the one who's also working on ZappChat, which will be the large language model version of Zapp Oracle, coming soon, we hope. It is already working in an alpha version, but we need to get next to a beta version. And this feature will soon be on the home page, and then you'll just be able to go there and see the latest Zapp Oracle news. I will be giving a talk in Boulder. If I realize a few of you will probably be available for that. It's coming right up this Friday at the Society for Scientific Exploration. I've spoken there a couple of times before. But the subject of the talk is of relevance. We'll make a video. We'll post it soon. And after the talk happens, of course, about 10 days from now. And
it's Tuesday, the 27th of January, 2000.
Okay, that is Siri. I did not ask you to say anything. Thank you. Okay. But the subject of it is one of extreme importance to anybody that happens to be a member of the Homo sapiens species, or really any species on the planet. It's what I call the singularity archetype, and I'll have more to say about that in a moment. One of the reasons for the neglect of the newsletter is that I've been extremely busy. When I published Parallel Journeys, my sci-fi epic, in May of 2023, and it took 45 years to complete that. That was with a master's degree in creative writing from NYU in the 80s to prepare for the task that I had chosen the Muse had commanded me since 1978. I knew enough about writing to know I hadn't created a good enough version yet. So it took me like 10 versions, but that came out, and I thought, well, how many more 45-year books do I have left? Given that I was 65 at the time, 68 now, given that, how many more 45-year books did I have left? And 2, maybe 3 if I strictly avoided gluten. I wasn't sure, but it turned out that I had a lot of notes for a sequel. It turned out the sequel came together just in a few months, and with all the 12 layers of editing a year. But that book is now complete unless any of you out there have some feedback that might cause me to change the text. And I'm putting a free version, it's linked in the newsletter, to Parallel Portal, the sequel to Parallel Journeys. And I would love to get any feedback, from line editing to effusive compliments to extremely effusive compliments. No, I'll take any kind of feedback at this point. Once a book's been published, I don't want to hear any negative feedback, because that's just going to cause suicidal ideation in me. But right now, before it's published, I take editing from anyone. My saying is, life is finite, but editing is infinite. And I won't finalize the book until I perform the audio book. And so that's kind of puts the book on a little bit of a deadline, in that also coming out in 2026 will be a third edition of my Singularity book. And that's my first book published by a major publisher, Inner Traditions. And then sometime probably in April, I'll be going to Vermont, where the Inner Traditions audiobook studio is, to record both books. And that's when I'll finalize the text for Parallel Portal. I figure I might find something else to fix in the process of performing the book. But the second, people complained about my saying, I'm going to have to watch that. The second edition of the Singularity book is already available free on zaporacle.com. If you would like to take a look at that, I will have to pull that down per my book contract with Inner Traditions when we get closer to publishing that book. So this is a chance to read that free. There's an audiobook version free of it, also in the same attached to the online version. That's the first edition. That's the same one you can buy as a trade paperback on Amazon or as a Kindle. Most of the new stuff, besides polishing up some language, are, we'll say, note added in 2023. So you could listen to the first edition and then just read those notes added. And there's also a video on the homepage called Looking Across the Event Horizon. That's kind of, well, actually, that wait for the new talk, because that'll be kind of a newer version of the same PowerPoint presentation. So, what is it that I will be talking about? Well, let me get to that in a minute. I'm going to catch up with some other news. I was honored last month to be on the teaching staff of a course at Esalen with three of my favorite writers and thinkers, Jeffrey Kripal and Joshua Cutchin, as well as Kevin Kahn. Jeffrey Kripal, the most famous by far of the four of us, has kindly offered to write an introduction for the third edition of the Singularity book. And so, and I put my contact info, it's just Jonathan Zapp, spelled the way my name is spelled, at hotmail.com, to send comments on any of this or anything at all. But especially if you have any feedback or research leads for Crossing the Event Horizon, the Singularity book, that would be greatly appreciated. And this is kind of the abstract of the talk I'm giving on Friday, but it's also a reminder of what the Singularity archetype is about, or an introduction for those of you who have no idea what it's about. It's a little bit dense, and I am reading it, but I'll try and deliver it as conversationally as possible. But the Singularity archetype defines and mediates two parallel event horizons: death and the evolutionary metamorphosis of the Homo sapiens species. The life cycle of an individual, the reason why it relates to both those event horizons is that the life cycle of an individual parallels the life cycle of the species, which both culminate in a profoundly transformative event. The individual event horizon of death may be viewed as an emergency by the ego, while the self, which was defined by Jung as the totality of all elements of the psyche, views it as an emergence. Similarly, the species evolutionary event horizon is viewed as an apocalyptic extinction level event by the ego, while the self views it as a transcendent quantum evolutionary jump. But I like to emphasize that we're not trashing the ego here, unlike some people who've gone Eastern or New Age folks who seem to think you need to eliminate your ego, which is a nonsensical idea. The ego is not wrong in its more grounded perspective. If I'm dying of a heart attack, that certainly presents as an emergency. It may not see what comes after. Similarly, the view of the species transformative event, that could present in apocalyptic ways, but it may be what's necessary for a quantum evolutionary change. And in fact, part of my theory is that there's an unconscious evolutionary mechanism that puts extinction level swords of Damocles hanging over our head. Now we have a new one, AI, which is a lot of what I will be talking about. That may be necessary to trigger a quantum evolutionary shift because organisms are conservative. They try and dial in that homeostasis, that equilibrium, and they will resist change to that. That's kind of a useful function because just like your body has a homeostasis, you don't want your heart rate or blood pressure wildly fluctuating. But it makes all organisms conservative and resistant to extreme change. Freud and Jung noticed this also about the human psyche, which is also organismic. So, manifestations of the singularity archetype include a number of classic aspects: a rupture of the plane of egoic, linear, time-based consciousness, an emergence into consciousness and communication that transcends linear time and egoic individuality. But remember, it inclusively transcends it. We'll be getting more into this when I talk about the telepathic network that I think is beginning to emerge on this planet. When you transcend something, it includes that which is transcended. If I transcend my ego, it doesn't mean I don't have an ego. It just means I have more communication with the self, but I certainly still have and certainly need an ego to function in the world. Telepathic consciousness and communication, in which linguistic intent may be expressed visually and in richer modalities than the predominantly word-based consciousness and communication, like what I'm using right now, what Terence McKenna called the small mouth noises. Episodic emergence scales up to a telepathic consciousness. Scales up to telepathic consciousness and communication networked amongst a small group or collectives of various magnitudes, while individuality is to varying extents conserved. So, unlike with the Pluribus TV series we'll be talking about, you can still retain your individuality while being part of a telepathic network, if it's done right. Other things I forgot to mention were that when you pass that event horizon, linear time changes, all basic core values, nation state, money, all those things may either be radically transformed or go away altogether. The singularity archetype may be experienced via near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, UFO, abduction, close encounter experiences, Kundalini experiences, psychotropic episodes. The singularity archetype represents a critical point where transformation, in ways impossible to fully anticipate, will massively shift human consciousness and therefore the nature of reality, in quotes, itself. And now here are some thoughts I just threw together on the emergent telepathic network aspect of the singularity archetype. And for those who haven't listened to earlier podcasts, in May 2023, when Parallel Journeys was published, and a parallel event began happening in the news with the explosion of AI, especially ChatGPT-4 at the time, blindsiding most of us, including me, because it seemed to suddenly be functioning at a much higher level than we had been led to anticipate. I had thought it was something like cold fusion that would always be said to be 10 years out, but suddenly here it was doing remarkable things. So now I believe, and I resisted saying this from 1978 to 2023, now I believe you cannot make an objective case that we're not in the singularity zone. We have stepped through the looking glass. We are in a time when novelty is becoming exponential, and AI will probably be the biggest driver of that. Unless organic evolutionary changes like a human telepathic network emerge, and those two key evolutionary catalysts could influence each other as well. So we're in that zone, and now the singularity archetype becomes ever more relevant, because this is the archetype that governs, mediates this transformative period, as it does the guaranteed one that we all have. Our guaranteed escape hatch, popularly known as death, is also governed by the singularity archetype. That's why there are so many archetypal aspects of near-death experience. But now I feel we're getting a signal that Homo sapiens is actually trying to manifest a telepathic network, which may be the only adaptation that would allow us to deal with AI and other threats. Because basically, now that we have lethal technologies that can cause extinction level events, the ones that almost all of us alive today have had during every year we've been alive, unless we're over 85 years old, are nuclear weapons. But nuclear weapons don't decide to make their own decisions. Now we have another one, AI, that is guaranteed to transform everything and will create many existential risks. Watch any YouTube with Eliezer Yudkowsky if you have any doubts about that. And I mentioned about the evolutionary mechanism already. So I did listen to season 1 of the Telepathy tapes and most of season 2. I think I was at first. It took me a while to get to season 1. Maybe I heard Kai Dickens on the Joe Rogan show and I got some kind of bad impression. It seemed like she was jumping to conclusions too easily or something. But she might be a somewhat flawed messenger. But it is definitely, the material itself is very worthwhile. I would highly recommend it. And the popularity of it is another part of the signal. The popularity of the podcast series that on some platforms exceeded the viewings of or listenings or whatever of the Joe Rogan podcast. So if we believe, and the Telepathy tape season 1 makes a pretty convincing case, that autistic non-speakers, that is people who are so profoundly autistic that they're not able to communicate in words because they lack the fine motor control that speaking requires, are telepathically networking on what these telepathic autistic kids call the hill, which is not a place as we understand it, but more just a telepathic nexus, then we may already be seeing this emergence within the subspecies, if you want to call it that, of profoundly autistic, non-speaking, telepathic young folk. And the extreme popularity of the Telepathic tapes podcast is the interest in this is another part of the signal. Several decades ago, I suggested, and I've suggested it to many friends, but I've never been ambitious enough to pull it off myself. I used to be a wilderness guide. Now I've got back issues, so I don't know how well I would do with a heavy backpack and a high mileage. But I've suggested people take a group wilderness experience, a challenging one, but it should be a group that already have high affinity bonds, like a group of close friends, let's say. And they would start hiking together, going out into the wilderness. It might take a few days of hiking. but with no talking allowed. So what this is doing is it's potentiating the desire to communicate, but without um, using small mouth noises. So any other latent telepathic way of communicating, the need for that will be increased as the group undergoes stress of any kind or have novel events that um, they might want to communicate to each other. And so they would start hiking together. Then after they would reach a certain place, like say by a stream, they would have the group separate and have everybody camp like 500 yards away from each other so they couldn't see each other. This was what was a setup I'm copying from an Outward Bound course I took in the 80s, where we were together. I had the most immersive. It was like being part of a hunter-gatherer tribe because we were hiking sometimes 18 miles a day, and we would then and you're kind of living and working and sleeping and everything with the same group of people who were total strangers before I met them, but it was a completely immersive social experience in a way that kind of lights up part of our ancestral unconscious because this is how for more than 99% of the time Homo sapiens have been around. This was how we lived as bands of hunter-gatherers living in a social immersion with a relatively small group. But then you would have punctuating that a total isolation experience, which was also a fasting experience in Outward Bound. That's another stress factor that could be added. It was a very high stress factor on Outward Bound because we were doing so much hiking in the Cascade Mountains of Washington, burning thousands of calories a day, that then to shift to a water fast was a huge metabolic shock to the system. So, and then we would, after the 3 days, bring the groups together. But now the part that I would have different is that one member of the group would build a sweat lodge big enough to accommodate the few people in this group. And and then I would like to see him take some sort of boundary dissolving substance. I realize most of those may not be legal, so like do this, maybe in another country where it is, or however you want to do it. Um, Maybe you could do it in South America, where ayahuasca could be taken legally or something. That might be the most desirable hallucinogen for the boundary dissolving agent, besides the sweat lodge, which is a boundary dissolving environment, because some of the early anthropologists called ayahuasca telepathine. It is not uncommon for there to be a telepathic network when people take ayahuasca, and where the ayahuasquero would sing certain songs and people would have a telepathic synesthesia where they would hear the song, they would perceive the song acoustically but also visually, but where they would all see the same visions while the song was happening, reportedly. I haven't experienced this. I have done ayahuasca, but I did not have a group telepathic experience of that kind, at least. And so this, and again, with no talking. And so this, I think, would be an experiment if you wanted to bring out any potential for telepathy in that group of people. That would be the ideal environment to trigger it. But I never actually got anybody that I suggested to it, as far as I know, to try that experiment. So just as the ego, as we mentioned earlier, sees death as emergency, while the self sees it as emergence, and just as the ego sees apocalypse in the conventional negative sense, not the unveiling sense of the etymology of the word, while the self sees a quantum evolutionary change, so too, when the ego sees the telepathic network, I like to use the phrase for the telepathic network, homo gestalt. I got that from the brilliant 1953 science fiction novel, Theodore Sturgeon, a masterpiece. It's an organic happening. And unlike most of the science fiction of that era, that is often imaginative but horribly written with like a very wooden writing style that characterized most of the sci-fi writer guys of that era, it's a stylistically brilliant novel. It really takes, if you do, especially if you do it on Audible, it takes a few listenings to really get it. But the ego will tend to see that telepathic network as threatening and as a catastrophic loss of individuality. And part of the reason for this is that it is in some ways could be perceived by the ego at least as an evolutionary regression, because I think a group telepathy is more the norm in nature than the exception. If you think about the perfect synchrony of a flock of birds flying or a school of fish, changing direction instantaneously altogether. And also what's reported with Australian Aborigines and so forth. I think that and in other tribal cultures, I think that there was a much higher level of group telepathy, but the ego was a positive evolutionary development, contrary to what some people think, because it created more of a firewall between the individual and the group telepathy, and that allowed the greatest engine of novelty ever created, individuality. That's what makes us such a remarkable species. I mean, cats and dogs have individual personalities, but human beings uh, seem to be the most individualized species. Now, my idea about novelty is that when you increase the temperature and the metabolism of novelty, then the outer edge of light and dark both intensify. So it's like the novelty is like the increased amplitude between these two intensified poles. And so, so a lot of the novelty will be dark. It's kind of like the opening line of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And he was writing about France during the French Revolution. But this is even more true of the present age. There's no other age I'd like to live in, but there are also plenty of dark things, that unprecedented dark things, in the last 100 years as well. So, the individuality that the ego creates, a lot of it is pathological, but it was still a positive evolutionary development. But now, because of the democratization of lethal technologies, as I pointed out in my essay, and it's a video on the homepage called AI and the Singularity Archetype, someone with the psychology of a school shooter, access to a $20,000 desktop gene editor, and open source AI such as Llama, there are many open or DeepSeek, could create novel pathogens that could create an extinction level event. The only reason this hasn't happened is that people with the psychology of a school shooter, the demographic of those with that psychology who can figure out how to work an assault rifle and pay for it, is much larger than those who can operate a $20,000 desktop gene editor. But you don't have to be a geneticist to do that. You can be a high IQ person just doing some online research. And no one has a rational argument against that. A number of the top AI technologists have pointed this out, but nobody really wants to think about it. Mustafa Suleiman was one of those people who wrote a book called The Coming Wave, points out, uses the term pessimism aversion. And we just don't want to think about this possibility, but it already exists. So we would need something like a telepathic network where you would have people that would be acutely telepathic. So even people who are not in the network, they could sense somebody who might be about to do that and stop them, for example. Or maybe they would have other psychic abilities like remote viewing. This would be the only way for us to survive, it seems, the fact that we now can put lethal technologies in the hands of ordinary people that they could do from a garage. So, this is why I think that the species is now trying to get this latent ability. Latent because when you have a latent ability, it will emerge episodically. before it emerges ubiquitously. And, we see that with all the paranormal abilities. They occur rarely, but dramatically, but they're not very easily replicable. Most people who have such abilities can't just do them on demand. Some can, but this would be the kind of this need of to save the whole genome is the kind of thing that could trigger it emerging in a much more collective way, and where some groups, maybe the autistic, non-speaking autistic kids, may act like a seed crystal. They even say things like this to awaken these latent abilities in others. But again, the ego will see this negatively, and this is a feature of the singularity archetype. It's every archetype has a light and dark aspect to it. So the classic dark aspect of the singularity archetype is apocalypticism. And so some of it is the ego's fear, but there also can be dark versions of a telepathic network. Maybe there'll be some powerful mutant in a particular telepathic network who dominates the group. We see something like that in Ted Sturgeon's More Than Human, for example, where there's one of the mutants acts like the executive function or the ego, but is a bit sociopathic. So in the Dune books, however, so a negative example of a homo gestalt or telepathic network would be the Borg in Star Trek, who famously say, "You will be assimilated," and in other words, your individuality will be completely homogenized and destroyed, basically, as you become kind of a zombie cyborg in this telepathic technological network. So with the Borg of Star Trek, it looks like AI mixed up with organic evolution, but in a very negative way. But in the Dune books, we see an example of Homo Gestalt in which individuality is conserved, because there are the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, very advanced warrior sisterhood, who are doing multi-generational evolutionary experiments, crossing royal bloodlines and so forth to try and create the Kwisatz Haderach. This is what Paul Atreides becomes. And and his mother, Jessica, is a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother. You become a Reverend Mother by surviving an initiatory rite called the Water of Life, where you take in a liquid that is produced when you drown a baby sandworm. And it's an extreme poison, but if you're advanced enough to be able to convert the poison in your body, and many die in the rite. This is something that's always been true of real initiatory experiences, is they must carry the threat of death. But if you survive, then you become a Reverend Mother, and then you have access to all the memories and maybe in other parts of the psyches of all other Reverend Mothers, living or dead, who have similarly survived that rite. So that would be an example of a Homo Gestalt where individuality is conserved, but it's transcended in the sense that you also have access to this telepathic network. Now, the new Apple TV series Pluribus, which I've watched, there's one season out, somewhat is mostly the negative view, because the content of individual memories is preserved, but the members of the new telepathic network are a little bit like a loving version of the Borg, and want to assimilate everyone. There's only 12 human beings who have not been made part of this telepathic network, and they want to assimilate them. So it's kind of a smiley face, a version of the Borg in some ways. And so we're definitely seeing in that series the ego's fear of the telepathic network that it would be. And then and the 12 human beings that survive act like some of them act like sociopathic, malignant narcissists, and we see extreme versions of egoistic consciousness in the ones that we track the most in the series. So this is why I think we're getting a real signal that the Telepathy Tape podcast, what's going on with the autistic kids, and the popularity of both the Pluribus series and the telepathy tapes all combine to make me feel we're getting a real signal that the species is trying to bring this forward. So also in the newsletter, you will see some videos you can watch. Please watch the 6.5-minute animated trailer for Parallel Journeys. One of my better podcasts in the few that I've posted there is one that says Chaos Magic News. And that was part of a remarkable series of events that happened several months ago where I started doing a chaos magic practice that became unexpectedly effective. To give you an idea, it was just something that I was reciting every morning and night, and it was trying to help bring attention to my work and help me with publishing opportunities, which then appeared within 10 days of starting the practice. But also within maybe 11 days of starting the practice, I was asked to talk about chaos magic on Chaos Magic News, a podcast I'd never heard of. They'd been following my work for years, at least one of them had. And so that was remarkable because I hadn't posted anything anywhere. I'd only told a couple of close friends that I was doing this practice, but there was nothing on social media or anything about it. So that was another aspect of the chaos magic practice that made it seem like it was having effects. And then so I had a kind of a litany I was reciting every morning and night. I would modify it and edit it to make it better or to adapt to changes in circumstance. And but you create a sort of a little word sigil to represent the whole thing. And at the time it was called Beacon 67. Now it's Beacon 68. I just put my age after it. And the idea of the beacon is pretty self-evident, was the idea that, I viewed it as like a lighthouse, that it was sending out rays that were out into the collective, that people I'm hoping that this YouTube will reach some people at least. But if they're the right people, it doesn't matter how many of them. I'm more interested in quality than quantity. But I saw it as a lighthouse. And then I had the litany on my phone in an iPhone memo. That was the most convenient way. So that way, when I woke up, it would be right there and I could recite it and so on. And after 3 or 4 days of doing this, an image appeared at the bottom of this memo. It was a graphic of a lighthouse. It was more detailed than an emoticon version of it, but it was not a photograph. It was like a line drawing. And I didn't put it there. I know you can add images to iPhone memos, but I'd have to watch a YouTube to know how to do it. I'm an aging baby boomer. I didn't do it. There's no iOS feature that adds appropriate images to memos. That would freak people out. It would be a privacy violation. It just appeared. So that was kind of a hardcore anomaly, but that suggested that the chaos magic practice was working, as well as the publishing opportunities that opened up almost immediately after I started doing it. So I describe all that in better detail in the Chaos Magic News podcast, but I also get into politics, Trump as chaos magician, and so forth. Then there's another one for Aeon Byte, Gnostic Radio, on mind parasites. There's something on synchronicity I did with Dr. Bernie Beitman called the Father's Dr. Synchronicity. He's a psychiatrist, but kind of the world's leading expert on synchronicity. Jeffrey Kripal and I will be doing a 3-way podcast with him on the 5th of next month, February 5th. Then there is a 4-hour plus podcast with Lily Fiorino, where the new webmaster and the AI engineer creating ZapChat, where we talk about her ideas of why the present large language models are not sentient, but of her work with a woman named Anna Terranova to create resonance modeled different architecture for AIs based on resonance rather than problem solving that could be sentient or that would at least be symbiotic. And this is something absolutely crucial because the current LLMs aren't just intrinsically dangerous, existentially dangerous. And then there's also a 4.5 hour podcast with Kevin Kahn on the experience that covers many subjects, including his summoning of a black triangle UFO. So that's what we've got for this edition of Chaos Magic News. Future ones will probably be a little bit shorter. And if you are experiencing the video but are not on the newsletter list, there's a sign up on the homepage. And please check out the Zap Oracle that has 720 cards. It's completely free. A free membership saves your readings indefinitely. And please read Parallel Journeys, which can be read free on the website. And it's got a reader control panel, kind of like Kindle. So there's a pretty good e-reader there. I'd prefer people would buy it on Amazon. That would allow you to leave a review. I think the Kindle version is only $7.99. It would help to support this website and my creative career that's operated at a six-figure loss, lifetime loss. But you can also support it by buying the hard copy of the book on Amazon, or the Audible version, I think, is the best version. If you want to listen and you don't have an Audible account, if you go on the homepage, you'll see something that says Mass Psychosis on the left and right. Well, hidden in there is a private version of the audiobook and a password, but don't post that publicly. But that would allow you to listen to the audio version, same for free, basically. So you can also read the second edition of the Singularity book free on the website and send me any feedback. So, and send it to Jonathan Zapp at hotmail.com. You can tell how old I am by the Hotmail email address. The only older one is AOL. So this is Jonathan Zapp of zapporacle.com signing off.